Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Natalie Jones. I'm Executive Vice President of Meridian International Center. Meridian is a nonprofit center for diplomacy based in Washington that strengthens relationships and engagement between the United States and the world in three ways: through global leadership exchange programs, through the arts and culture, and through collaboration on shared global challenges. And we are proud partners with the U.S.-Mexico Foundation on their 360 exchange program that builds networks of emerging leaders from both the United States and Mexico to help better understand the bilateral relationship and help strengthen it. We're here today to explore how soft power can help advance and strengthen the North American identity. Diplomacy is evolving. Joseph Nye, the Harvard professor who coined the term soft power, described diplomacy's evolution like this. In the 19th century, we had diplomacy 1.0, where we had government leaders talking to each other behind closed doors. In the 20th century, we had diplomacy 2.0, where governments were not just talking to each other, they were talking to people in countries to try to influence their governments. And now in the 21st century, we're in the era of diplomacy 3.0, where diplomacy is being conducted between people, through civil society, through the private sector to influence both governments. And here today to help navigate this new era of diplomacy, we're joined by four, soon to be five leaders that help represent the different facets of soft power diplomacy, from culture to corporate diplomacy to digital diplomacy. And I'm so pleased to be joined, starting with Rachel Poynter, who is the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs. And Rachel is serving at the highest levels of government in the U.S. and has devoted much of her career to North American issues. And from the private sector, we have Brittany Masalosalo from HP and Teresa Verthein from Salesforce. They bring their unique experience of having both served in government and now are heading up global government affairs for two major multinational companies. And then we have Enrique Acevedo, who is an award-winning journalist from CBS, and covers global leaders and global events, and really can give us the pulse on how digital media is shaping diplomacy. And we'll soon be joined by Daniela Michel, who is the founder and visionary of the Morelia International Film Festival. So let's get started. And Rachel and Enrique, I'm going to turn it over to you first to help set the scene. Why are we here? Why is the North America identity important? What does it why does it matter? And then Enrique, help us take a step back. We have been, this group has been with each other for the last day, and we're all in agreement that the North American identity is important, but how does the rest of the world see us? How does Europe see us? How does Asia see us? Do they see a North America identity? So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today, and really a pleasure to share the stage with the distinguished panel. And this topic is so timely and relevant. So I'm thrilled to be with you all today to talk a little bit about it and really explore this whole concept. We are three sovereign countries that have rich and diverse populations, and three countries that are also bound by history, bound by geography, by culture, by family, in strong economic ties. And we're in a moment really filled with a lot of opportunities and challenges. If the pandemic changed us, it changed us together. More of our lives are online. Certainly the pandemic showed the imperative for resilient supply chains, and honestly showed the imperative for inclusive growth. And I think our three countries and the three governments are really looking at this moment in terms of what does it mean to be a citizen in North America having lived through what we've lived through? And how do we take advantage of those opportunities and the challenges that exist, because there are many. The Biden administration worked with our Mexican and Canadian colleagues to relaunch the North American Leaders Summit last year. And the priorities included a number of things: inclusion, how we leverage North American competitiveness in this global environment. And that, of course, is looking at things like the supply chain disruptions that we lived through. How do we address the climate crisis, clean energy transition? So this topic and this conversation today is incredibly relevant and timely. There are also pieces going on domestically in the United States that have very clear implications and opportunities for us in North America. So for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed in the United States, there are opportunities to work with our Canadian and Mexican colleagues and counterparts to think about how we move forward in the North America space on clean energy transition. Same with the Chips and Science Act, which allows for us to think through semiconductors and some of the space there of how we engage in North America. So I think for us, we're really looking at what does this identity mean? What can we leverage in North America? And so I'll put a couple of additional concepts on the table. We innovate really well together. We create things together. We do that in the economic space. But boy, we have a lot to leverage in the public diplomacy space and in that soft power space. I had the opportunity to fly here to Mexico City with Mexican ambassador to the United States, Esteban Moctezuma, and he and I had the opportunity to talk about this panel. And he presented the idea of complementarity. How do we work together to complement each other rather than compete with each other? And he noted that in our border communities, US-Canada border, United States-Mexico border, those communities do this day in and day out. They have an identity that is binational and multicultural. There is a need to consistently innovate and create together, and that we have a lot to learn from those border communities as well. So I really look forward to this conversation about how we can really strengthen, and I think there's a lot that the private sector and cultural institutions have to offer and to help guide the governments as well in terms of how we think about an innovation culture in North America, perhaps, and how we leverage our public diplomacy skills, particularly coming out of an era where we are so much more online than we ever have been before. Thank you. Enrique.
How does the world see North American identity? I think the common answer would be in terms of the evident differences within the region. Powerful, weak, developed, underdeveloped, wealth, poverty, north, south. But we really need to dig deeper and know that probably the main difference here between Mexico, the US, and Canada is two different versions of Western civilization. One that is coming from a very proud past, a millenary culture, and another that's always obsessed in the future, on innovation, moving forward, and those two visions clashing, right? I think, people also see that in many ways, but, and quoting Octavio Paz, he used to say that Americans, and I would broaden that to the rest of the world, I would say foreigners generally don't come to Mexico to find Mexico. Paz used to say that they come to look for their enthusiasms, their obsessions, their phobias, their hopes and their interests, and that's usually what they find. And so when we talk about a North American identity, I think our best ally, and I told you this outside the context of this panel, our best ally is demographics. And I say that because I'm North American. I grew up with NAFTA. I've always lived between two worlds, two cultures that borrow from each other, learn from each other, and have grown together. Hablo español, hablo inglés. I do Spanglish sometimes, a little bit of both.
Yep.
I watch the Cowboys on Sunday and America Chivas any other given day. I consume media in Spanish and English. I love Mexican food, but I can't resist a good cheeseburger. So I am North American in every sense of the world. I wish I knew how to speak French, and maybe that would get me closer to at least that French part of Canada. But I think that's,
Well, I want to pick up on that thread. Demographics and demography is destiny. How is migration changing and impacting and could potentially help the North America identity? And I throw that out as a question for the group, if anyone wants to bite on that.
I'll let you take that one.
Sure. There's no doubt that the movement of people in the hemisphere is certainly one that is impacting all of us. And there's a lot of opportunity to think about how those flows through the hemisphere, impact and how we, North America, our three countries, face the challenge of hemispheric migration together and make sure that we think about humane protections in place, and at the same time that we celebrate and really raise up the various populations we see and the identity of the populations that are traveling through the hemisphere and then settling in each of our countries. Certainly something that I think the three governments are talking about on a daily basis.
And if I may, just following up on that, I think we were used to looking at migration south-north, but now more and more we see a lot of American expats here in Mexico.
Right, very good point.
Walk around Condesa, Roma, you'll hear people speaking in English more than Spanish. And I think it's not a coincidence that we're seeing that. They're taking advantage of remote work. They're taking advantage of, it's not the traditional migration we've seen from the US in the past, people moving to Ajijic and Chapala and San Miguel de Allende. It's young people from New York and LA and Chicago coming to Mexico and revitalizing in many ways some of those communities. With all the challenges that entitles, the gentrification, being the main one, but I also think that now more and more we're starting to think of migration as a two-way street, not just south and north.
Yeah, and Brittany, we talked a little bit about demographics, and you raised the issue of equity. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you're looking at that from a private sector lens.
Yeah, I'll start by just kind of maybe giving a high-level overview of commercial diplomacy as I see it and the importance of that. When Rachel gave her brilliant points about how we're going to advance progress across the Americas and really foster what is the North American way, I think she mentioned that the private sector is going to be critical and pivotal in that. When we talk about innovation, when we talk about culture, we talk about research and development, we talk about economic development, the private sector sits at the corner of all of that. And I think that's a responsibility that we take very seriously more now than ever. And that has become a forcing function for us to be front and center on our commercial diplomacy priorities. And for me at HP, this is something that I take near and dear to my heart, which is the reason why I'm here in Mexico today, because I leverage the opportunity to do just that. To answer your question about demographics, the private sector sees demographics, but they're almost irrelevant for us. What we see is we see opportunity. And when we look at the North American way, we see opportunity full stop across Canada, the United States, and in Mexico. And we see ways to leverage and maximize opportunity. And demographics is a key piece of that. I know at HP right now, we're focusing very in depth on equitable access to opportunities and what that means, not just what that means, but what our responsibility is in that. How are we making sure that we're reaching out to the ruralist communities, the underrepresented communities, the lower socioeconomic communities, and helping to ensure that they have equitable access to that? Yeah. And I think that as we're seeing migration patterns going both south to north and north to south, that we're very cognizant and deliberate in that. I love the example that you gave about remote workers being able to relocate. There's inequitable access to that opportunity right now. Not everybody has that. But how can we at the private sector look at that and say, this may be an opportunity. This may be an opportunity for us to strengthen. This may be an opportunity for us to tap into a workforce that we haven't previously had access to.
Yeah. Tiffany, the Edelman Global Trust Barometer now cites businesses as the most trusted institutions over government. Sorry, Rachel. Over media.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Enrique.
No
And,
offense taken.
and there's an incredible opportunity for businesses to lead on societal issues, some of the issues that Brittany was talking about. How do you use corporate diplomacy at Salesforce to lead on some of those issues?
Absolutely, great question. So I think that precisely what you're mentioning right now and how businesses are beginning to be one of the most trusted stakeholders has to do with the fact that we have been doing, I think, a good job of communicating in terms of the values, the corporate values that we all have. So it's not just, we don't yet just use public diplomacy to talk about our products and services. We use it to talk about how we develop those products and services in an ethical way, how we operate in a way that is mindful of the communities where we exist. We have external pressures from stakeholders, from regulators, from governments, from public opinion, and we have internal pressures as well from employees, a way of attracting and retaining talent is for companies to espouse the values that talent is concerned about. So as we craft our corporate diplomacy efforts around the values that we hold near and dear, in Salesforce, we've, I think, done a very good job of considering our wide stakeholders within those corporate values. We just integrated sustainability as our 5th corporate value in February. We consider the planet to be one of our primary stakeholders. And we've put our money where our mouth is, right? We don't only talk about the environment, we don't only advocate for environmental issues, we also help support actual projects that are taking care of the environment. So for instance, we just announced a first round of investments in climate justice efforts and environmental reconstruction efforts, $11 million that have been put towards projects around the world, including Mexico. $100 million to be invested over the course of 10 years. So these are all things, this values-based communication, I think, is what we've done well, and the reason that we are beginning to acquire this legitimacy before public opinion as corporate actors.
Yeah. And Teresa and back to Brittany, you both served in government. You both have had experience working with diplomatic tools. How have you carried over that experience into the private sector? What are some of the tactical kind of tools, from public-private partnerships to other things that you use to carry some of this out?
Do you want to go first, Teresa?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. For starters, you just know how to speak the language. When you serve in government, policymakers have a language that they like to use. They have a specific way of talking, whether it's the acronym like DAS.
I see that you're like eyeing Rachel as your.
Whether it's acronyms
We
like
don't use
saying
acronyms.
DAS,
They're the worst.
you know how to speak the language, and I think that's kind of the first step. But beyond knowing how to speak the language, you're able to empathize with the bureaucracy and some of the experiences that they're having. But probably most importantly, you just have an appreciation for the humanity of our government leaders. And what I mean by that is that not just are they this apparatus that's working, this government that's working to implement policies, but they're also individual people. And they're individual people that you can develop meaningful relationships with. You can become reliable resources to each other, and you can help build out meaningful progress in that way. I love being able to have that kind of relationship with Rachel, for example, where we can talk about what's practically implementable, what we're seeing at the private sector or the economic or the business level, and her being able to speak about the spirit of a policy initiative or what they're trying to achieve, what constituency that they're trying to serve. It helps just create a relationship, and I think it's a very important one. I do.
And I would just add to that, I think that one of the key tools or mindsets that working for the government gave me in terms of public diplomacy efforts is more about the cooperation among internal stakeholders within the company.
Oh, yeah.
So when you work for government and you're trying to develop a narrative, there's a bunch of sharing among different stakeholders and areas that have buy-in into the topic that are integrated in order to craft a narrative that is complete and in terms of the private sector that communicates our broad value, right? So when we are trying to craft a corporate diplomacy narrative, it's not just the people from government affairs that are writing this. It's people from comms teams, obviously, but there's also people from maybe our ethical teams, maybe from our product teams and legal teams, and that cooperation is necessary in order to craft effective and complete narratives, which is a key part of the public diplomacy effort.
Wonderful. Thank you. Daniela, welcome. I know it's a busy time for you, so we are so glad to have you here, but I want to turn it over to cultural diplomacy. And you created the Morelia Film Festival with the vision and mission of sharing the Mexican culture with the world. Talk to us a little bit about how you use film and culture as a tool of diplomacy.
Well, I come from first of all, I'm very, very sorry for the delay. As I speak, I'm closing now. The program with the catalog is being printed right now, so I'm sorry for that.
No need to apologize.
So, well, I come from a very different background. I studied cinema, and then I studied literature. But I studied cinema in Mexico at a time when Mexican film industry was really broken, if not dead. Teachers, when we studied filmmaking, they were saying things like, why are you studying filmmaking? Mexican cinema is dead, and especially for women, right? So it was a very difficult decision, but I had to leave film school, and then I studied literature, but I always had this idea of creating a space that was much more kinder to young filmmakers. So I created, many years ago, in the 1990s, I created the Jornadas de Cortometraje Mexicano in Cineteca Nacional. I created this event where we showcase short films that were produced in Mexico, which were the things that were keeping alive the spirit of Mexican cinema. I worked at the time in TV and in advertising, so I used my savings. I worked from my house. I had some, in the 90s, I had some great people who backed me up, who now are very successful, like Alejandro González Iñárritu, who was a great sponsor at the time, the 1990s, before Amores Perros. But I created this little space in my apartment, and then we had this cinema in the Mexican Cinematheque, which depends on the Mexican government. But it was really tough. Then I talked to Alejandro Ramirez, who's in the year 2000. Alejandro Ramirez owns Cinépolis, which is the second largest exhibition chain in the world. At the time, it was smaller because it was the year 2000. But I told him my idea of bringing the short filmmakers from Mexico City to Morelia, because Morelia is the cultural capital of New Spain. It's a very beautiful place. It has 7 universities and also the headquarters of Cinépolis there in Morelia. So to my surprise, he agreed, and he, from doing a festival in my living room, having a festival in Cinépolis in Morelia Centro, he remodeled 5 theaters. So we started by, I think, being very lucky. We had, from the beginning, we had a great engagement, collaboration with the Critics Week of the Cannes Film Festival, which is a section that discovered Iñárritu, by the way, and Guillermo del Toro, is also a good friend. And so they started to show their films in our festival. But the mission of Morelia was, and it still is, this is our 20th anniversary, by the way, it still is to promote Mexican filmmakers. of shorts, feature films, and documentary films. Over the years, we've had hundreds of thousands of people attending, hundreds of guests attending. We are a non-profit organization, totally non-profit. We receive funds from everywhere, but that doesn't make us the film festival. We're not even Cinépolis Film Festival. We're not the festival of the government of Michoacán or the federal government. We strive a lot to get funding. That keeps us going and gives us a lot of independence, because no matter who's in the government, who owns certain companies, the mission of the festival is bigger, and we've worked very hard in creating possibilities for Mexican filmmakers, because we have juries that are international always, so it's not like my friend who's a Mexican is going to give me the award. No, it's all international jurors. Also people who have won the Palme d'Or, or people who are really, really important in the film world. So they become ambassadors of Mexican cinema and of Morelia.
Yeah.
It's been hard, as you know, because to say it in a nice way, I mean, Mexico doesn't have always the best image outside. So, but we've been very, very lucky. We never had any situation which was...
Can I pick up on that? Question for you. So, cultural diplomacy, I think, brings people together around shared values, but I think film in particular has such power to help give people perspectives into cultures that they don't know about, or to help change misperceptions.
Yes.
Can you recommend a film that all of us should see that will help change, or people who you would, if there is one film that you could recommend to people who are looking to learn more about Mexico, or maybe, have misperceptions about Mexico? It's like naming your favorite child,
Well, it's a tough question, because I have so many films. I mean, every year I watch over 1,000 films. I have 600 submissions to Morelia of Mexican films, and also I travel around a lot of film festivals around the world. I see a lot of international films. It is hard to say one main film that would describe Mexico. I think that Mexico is a very diverse country. I mean, we have lots of points of view. We have filmmakers that come from very poor backgrounds, indigenous filmmakers. We have filmmakers that come from well-to-do families, people who have studied abroad filmmaking, So it's a very, very diverse. Nevertheless, I think it's a very small film community anyway, because everybody knows everybody in the Mexican film industry, I mean, it is a situation, but I mean, there are films like, I would say maybe, I think that the film that I've heard, and is a personal favorite of mine too, because I've known him for many, many years since I was a child, is Alfonso Cuarón Roma. I think that film really speaks volumes of how our social structure works in Mexico. At first, people were kind of surprised that middle-class families have nannies, and the relationship between the nanny, the person who helps the mother, who's a single mother, is kind of difficult to explain, and in these times, it's difficult not to be seen as a certain way of slavery or whatever. I mean, people will say, "Oh, why do you have a nanny that lives in your house all her life?" But it's a kind of a characteristic of our Mexican society. A lot of people have had nannies, Right. But that film, I think that's, I would say, in recent years, the most important film that shows a lot of aspects of Mexican society.
Did everyone write that down? Okay. Thank you. I want to touch on another point that you brought up, which is using cultural diplomacy to highlight different identities within a country and different populations. And something that we had talked about before this panel was how the concept of out of diversity comes unity. And I think we've seen, I know certainly in the US, as we look at public diplomacy campaigns, we're not looking at a monolithic identity of the United States or even in Mexico and Canada. How can that help us define North America cultural identity? I don't know if anyone, if Rachel or Enrique.
Just because when you said that, I immediately thought of, the faces of cultural power in the U.S. Beyonce, LeBron James, Bad Bunny, they're all Latino and black. Different from the faces of corporate power and political power in the U.S., right? Much more representative of the demographic construction of American society today. And I think that's wonderful. We were saying demographics can lead the way. Well, I think it certainly applies in this case. Alejandro González Iñárritu, I think it's also part of that soft American power because he's part of Hollywood and his films are part of that industry. So I think it's interesting to see that diversity is being reflected in American cultural power and cultural diplomacy. The sounds and the textures of U.S. cultural power around the world are black and Latino, and that's pretty cool, I think.
Rachel, can you talk a little bit about kind of public diplomacy approaches?
Absolutely.
That you're seeing?
And I think Enrique is exactly right. I mean, to utilize these tools that are really representative of each of our citizens and our culture within each of the countries is really key. How do we leverage our diversity to really show unity? One of the things that we talked about this morning in a different panel was how influential and persuasive culture, one film, one sporting event, can be in terms of how we present North America. Sometimes our governments can be unwieldy, and the role of culture, the role of the private sector to be able to push us forward, all of our countries in a direction is really something that can't be underestimated. So, when I think about this as someone who's in the government trying to figure out how we can facilitate and how we can support, that is key. What are the things that the private sector and cultural institutions can do to help push the governments? And what can the governments do to help facilitate some of those positive, pieces when we look at public diplomacy? One thing I think about is workforce development. What is the piece that we can do to help facilitate and help the private sector achieve the goals, help Daniela's efforts and other similar type of efforts if we're thinking about sports diplomacy. So I think those are the types of things you see the governments really focused on right now in some of those leaders meetings, in our foreign ministers level meetings, and then at the working level, right? Rolling up the sleeves and figuring out what is it that we need to do in the regulatory space that can then allow you all to work a little bit better, and then put forward that notion of leveraging all that we have to offer.
May I add to that?
Yes. Teresa.
Okay, so how to leverage different identities from the private sector in the region. I think, and I'm sorry to sound like a broken record talking about values all the time, but I think that's actually the commonality, right, throughout the region, and speaking a language of values allows us to find a common language among the maybe 3 different identities that exist in the region, 3 different countries. But there are also differences, as you have all been rightly pointing out. And there's also an effort that goes into translating those values into the different idiosyncrasies and identities that exist in the different countries. For instance, the value of equity. How does it translate in Mexico differently than it translates in the United States? You were talking about workforce development. We try to develop workforce development programs that are inclusive and attract talent that has traditionally been left out of economic opportunity and opportunities in the tech space. That inclusiveness is different in the United States than it is in Mexico, for example. We target different groups in order to include them in our programs, right? So these efforts, when a company becomes large, when its impact becomes large and transcends geographies, these programs and these public diplomacy efforts are not headquarters-led, right? They are developed by teams, by local teams that help feed into those core values and adapt them to the local context.
Helpful. We alluded a little earlier to some of the political pressures that our countries are facing, and some of the, sometimes our countries don't see eye to eye. And how do those conflicts, translate to the rest of the world? How does that impact the North American identity? And how can we insulate ourselves from that? And I'm looking kind of at Enrique, because I'm sure you have covered all of the roller coaster that over the last few years that our countries have endured. Like, how does, what's the good, bad, ugly of that for the North American identity?
Well, I'll start by letting you in on a little secret here in Mexico. People don't like it when people in the US describe themselves as American. Because they say, well, what do you mean? We're all American. We all live in the American continent, no? Somos americanos, somos todos. It's a sort of a cultural nuance, because I don't think people in the US mean American as a sort of a continental term.
Right.
Right? It's just
shortcut.
But it goes from that to the historic tensions that we have experienced. Sorry, the mic is on this side. I should know better after 20 years of doing TV. So the historic tensions between two countries, the fact that, until very recently, if you look at things in a historic perspective, a good portion of the U.S. territory was still Mexico. I was just working on a story for our Culture and Race Unit because of Hispanic Heritage Month in the U.S. last week, and I was working on a story about language and about Spanish being perceived as an American language, right? And I learned about some of the segregation, the history of discrimination that the Mexican American population has suffered. So there are real tensions and real scars that go way back. And for people like me, who were born again in a time of NAFTA and Mexicans being much more Americanized than they used to be, and Americans taking notice of Mexico and Mexican culture much more than they used to, that seems a little foreign and not extremely relevant to the conversation today. But you can't ignore that. Going back to the Trump administration, which I think was an important point in understanding how those tensions are always there for political exploitation and can be instantly activated. I think that at a time when we're witnessing ethno-nationalistic forces take hold of our political discourse and come to power, not just in the US, but also here in Mexico, when nationalism is being used as an element to divide people. I think more than ever we need to speak of that North American identity and look beyond the moment, look beyond the players, whoever's at the White House, or I was going to say Los Pinos, but the Palacio Presidencial, and whoever's in government in Canada, and create this sort of regional identity. We've done it with trade, embedded in every dollar that moves regionally. There's manufacturing from Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. Now, how do we do it with people?
People, right.
I wish I had a smarter answer to that, but I think the tensions are real and they're there. They're always on the surface, waiting for someone to unfortunately exploit them.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about digital media, because that is a game changer for the Diplomacy 3.0 world that we're living in. In Diplomacy 2.0, governments could create content that they would push out, and there was really just kind of one source. Now, everyone who has a phone is a content creator. How do we harness those stories and those narratives, and use social media and digital media to help advance the North American identity? And I would throw that open to Enrique and anyone on the panel. Also, how do we, how can we amplify culture in a way where, years ago, the only way that you kind of experienced culture was either through being there in person or through radio or TV, but now everyone has access to culture.
Yeah, I'll be super brief because I've talked a lot, but I would say, first of all, when we talk about the media, I would invite everyone to think of the fact that we are all the media today. It's not people on TV or on radio, people in cinema. We are all the media. We all have the capability of producing content, disseminating that content, sharing information. So I think it's part of our own dissatisfaction with media, that it's sort of a mirror in which we're seeing ourselves as societies, because we have all become the media. And that's also an opportunity, right? The opportunity is to tell the stories of our cultures and to tell the stories that resonate individually, but also that can create spaces of real dialogue and community. The challenge for everyone, I think, today, I spoke with people at the White House recently. I was in DC this week, and it used to be that the president would come out and say something about the Inflation Reduction Act or whatever policy he was putting forward, and that would be news for a while. President Biden came out and said this, and we passed this law through Congress, and so that would get you at least a couple of news cycles. Today, even the power of the presidency in the US is not enough to control those news cycles. So the challenge is, how do you create premium content that performs well across platforms and cuts through audience fragmentation, and again creates this space for community and dialogue? And it's something that I'm trying to figure out as a journalist, working for CBS News, for 60 Minutes, the most respected, most watched news show in the history of television in the US. And I think that it's a challenge for the private sector, a challenge for movies, at a time where streaming has become a real competitor. Platforms are challenging the monopoly on film distribution. So I'd love to hear what others have to say about that, because there's much I could learn from that.
Daniela.
Well, I would say that in these 20 years, we've seen obviously the media changing so much. There are about, before the pandemic, there were 9,000 film festivals in the world. Now only 3,000 have survived. Of those 3,000, we're happy to say we're the 4 largest in followers in our media. I mean, we have, out of 3,000, we're in the 4th place, reaching out with media. We have a team that works 24/7, creating content, not only about the festival, but about international news, about film. We have access to all these other festivals. We know we have a lot of colleagues. So it's become really, really important for us to have this tool, because we have a lot of followers, not only from Mexico, but from around the world. And somehow the Morelia Film Festival has its presence. I mean, we're just, the first one is the Cannes Film Festival, then the Berlin, Sundance, and Morelia, it was only 20 years old. So we worked really, really hard to have these young audiences. And because of the pandemic, you're right, I mean, there were a lot of things, habits that were changing, people watching films more in platforms, in streaming, but I think that more and more people are going back to cinema, because I think that the people are a little bit fed up being in their own house and not being concentrated enough in one film. I think that we will continue having a hybrid kind of festival. We will, of course, do a full festival with our guests. But like last year, where we were hybrid as well, we had almost 4 million people watching whatever we were showing, which is very nice, you know, in TV and in streaming and everything. So people were very aware of what we were doing. So we don't want to miss those audiences that cannot travel to Mexico, to Morelia specifically, to watch what we're offering and to discover how exciting Mexican cinema has become.
Great. We're going to do a few more questions for the panel, and then we're going to invite our audience members to ask some questions. But I want to turn back over to corporate diplomacy. And I recently heard someone say that every company needs a foreign policy. So help, give the audience, the business leaders who are in the audience, who are at this conference, how do they shift their mindsets to become corporate diplomats? I think, and it's not just leaders who are in the global government affairs space. I think it's really across the board. But what are some pieces of advice that you would give to your business, your fellow colleagues?
I'll start off on this one. I think you're absolutely right. Every company does need to have, at least every multinational company needs to have a foreign policy. They need to have foreign affairs. By way of background, I worked in the Foreign Affairs Office at the White House, so that gives perspective into how HP is thinking about it, where foreign policy is critical. I think over the last 5 years, one thing that we've learned is that we are subject to the whims of government's foreign policy, and we have to become active players in that process. Whether it was through COVID-19 and seeing the way local politics and geopolitics impacted our ability to do business, or even looking at what we're seeing right now with the geopolitical disruptions all around the world, the Russia invasion in Ukraine and the business implications there, the community implications there, other areas where there's volatility. And what we have found is that foreign policy over the last 20, 30 years was a pretty significant tailwind for us that allowed us to enjoy global growth, globalization, and we were able to kind of sit back and maximize on where governments wanted to see economic growth and proliferation. But now, as more governments are turning to regionalization or into more nationalist or populist policies, we're having to react as well. That means that we have to have our own foreign policy in place. Whether it's making business decisions or also just looking at the communities where we can be most impactful. We have to take all of this into consideration every single day. And I think that that's where corporate diplomacy, really where the rubber meets the road, is being able to be active participants in governments where we operate or where we have business at, being active participants in those conversations, having those relationships, making sure that we are positioning ourselves as credible, reliable, as a resource, as a partner, as a broker through these conversations. And then I'll also tie in what's probably most critically important on there and do a little bit of table stumping on what Teresa was saying, that it's all about values-based. Because at the end of the day, our foreign policy is going to align with what our company's values is as well. So whether this is making a strategic decision that we're not going to operate in certain autocratic areas where that country's government may not align with our values as a company, or making the decision where we're going to advance investment because we want to advance, for example, the North American way. This all ties into us having part of that foreign policy plan. Teresa, do you have?
Sure, I'll just add, and this is what I can speak to. We have a very successful model which actually aims to transcend some of the difficulties that we may face when specific governments do not align with our Salesforce values or where we have other difficulties engaging. We advocate for multi-stakeholder collaboration, right? And this is something that actually, this gives me an opportunity to share the message with everybody who is here today and to all the business leaders that are in the audience. Multi-stakeholder collaboration allows you to precisely meet your objectives without having to depend so much on particular historical, political context in different countries. So we try to incorporate the government wherever we can into these collaborations, but where such collaboration is not doable, we have a wealth of stakeholders that we can collaborate with in order to pursue those objectives and meet them. So it's not only a question of government, it's a question of other industry stakeholders, it's a question of civil society, of academia, of the media. All of those stakeholders together allow us to transcend those difficulties.
Great. Rachel, are there enough traditional and legal frameworks and institutions in North America to help define the North America identity? And if not, what are those gaps and what can we do to help you? You are engineering this, but you need partners. Yeah. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
It's a great question, Natalie, and I think that Brittany also spoke to the importance of our relationships with all of you, the private sector, the NGO world, those who are experts like Enrique in digital diplomacy and working in social media. And I think the key is that engagement with stakeholders, and it's one of the key pieces of what we're doing as we engage both in our high-level dialogues with Mexico, our high-level dialogues with Canada, and then our trilateral space. It's a great question in terms of institutions and whether or not they exist enough. I think there is certainly work to be done to strengthen our institutions and to really get the feedback that we need from you all in terms of what are the things that need to be strengthened in, for instance, the regulatory world. As we look to help facilitate some of this really excellent positive collaboration. I'd also be remiss if I didn't highlight some of our traditional public diplomacy tools and how they shift and they change with all of the change in what we've seen in digital diplomacy. We have, for instance, our public diplomacy tools that really focus on the notion of inclusion and the fact that those people-to-people ties are the enduring ties. We have an initiative called the Young Leaders of the Americas Initiative, and I'll just give you one quick example. A Oaxacan chocolatier who really came and used that, being a fellow within that program, to help launch his business. And this program allows for exchanges with business, with organizations in the United States. He just recently launched a TED Talk utilizing the digital space, to really illustrate the artisanal chocolate making in Oaxaca. He's also been able to grow his company and employs 26 indigenous families in Oaxaca. So I think the challenge for government is really, I ask all of you to continue to challenge us to make sure that we're using our tools in the way that makes the most sense. And that is really focused on the changes we see and the trends that we see that are consistently being updated by, those around us, private sector, but also our youth.
Excellent, excellent.
And to add, if I may,
yes,
Natalie,
please.
I think it also, this helps. Behind institutions there are individuals, people, faces, conversations. The fact that we have an incredible panel today here in Mexico City, that people traveled here right now to talk about this, to get people excited about creating a North American identity, that out of all the panels today, they decided to, I'm going to sit down and listen to these people talk about these issues. At the end of the day, it comes down to that, right? The institutional infrastructure is there. How it operates, how efficient it is, it comes down to how much individuals are invested and engaged in this. And I think what we're doing right now may not seem like it's going to move the needle in a big way, but it comes down to individuals having those conversations and learning a little bit more about what the different efforts are trying to do.
Absolutely, and I'll add in there from Meridian's perspective, that's what we believe, is that it is up to us to create our peer networks, global networks across industries, across sectors that can insulate from the ups and downs of political relationships and institutions. So that's why we find the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, what they're doing with the 360-degree program, so important. We would love to have a trilateral program where we bring together U.S., Canada, and emerging Mexican leaders together. So again, thank you to our partners at the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. But I'd like to open it up to the audience. But I'm going to tip off our panelists. I'm going to come back with a speed round, asking all of our panelists to describe the North American identity in 3 words or less as our closer. But I see a question in the back row. Yes, please introduce yourself. Or you can
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Evodio Kaltenecker. I'm a teacher in international business at Tech Monterrey. Maybe we do not have the frameworks, but we will have, well, the 3 countries will have a once in a lifetime or at least once in a generation opportunity to spread the word about this North American identity with the World Cup 2026.
Yes.
So it's maybe not a question to Mr. Acevedo. How do you see that? How countries should do to take advantage of this worldwide loudspeaker?
Well, I'm super excited about the World Cup taking place in these 3 countries. I mean, first of all, because I'm a huge soccer fan, and also because I think those are the opportunities. I think Richard was referring to that. Sporting events, like cultural moments, that really drive the conversation forward in a way that all the framework, all the diplomacy, even the politics really can't. It's going to be super interesting to see how that works in terms of mobility, right? I often talk to people in New York who have a view of Mexico that's a little antiquated, and they say, well, yeah, we want to do this story in Mexico, but all the traveling, and it's like, do you know it takes less time to get from New York to Mexico City than it takes to get from New York to LA? Or just, there are more connections to Mexico than are to most major cities in the US, within the US. So the logistics of that is going to be super interesting. I think people are going to realize how integrated we are, and by people I mean all the people coming from all over the world to watch the World Cup as fans, and they're going to say, well, I didn't know it was that easy to move around Mexico, and so go to Vancouver, and go to be in Dallas, and then be in Monterrey. I think that's going to help what we're discussing here today, and it's an incredible example. I don't know why it escaped the panel, but I think it's a good example of North American identity.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Antonio Carranza. I work at the Mexican Embassy in Washington in the time of the first NAFTA, and then in Canada as well. So 1995, and I saw much of what was happening in culture and economic affairs. And from the talk that you have shared us, I think that there are, in education and culture, things that are driving us away, because obviously we have in education a very strong sense of nationality. I don't see culture necessarily being the force of a North American identity. In Canada, there was a very strong force against to protect cultural industries and so on. So there's, on that side, a protectionist leaning in education and culture. However, when I hear about the corporate culture, I do see that as a layer that goes across Canada, through the United States and Mexico. And I see in Mexico a very different path of values in Mexican companies and foreign companies. If you take a look at how we treat women in Mexican businesses, it's very different from the culture of integration, diversity, and so on. And I think that if we think about ourselves as people that either spend time in education institutions or in a corporate world, there is no doubt that there is much more to work in building a North American culture from the point of view of our corporate culture than from other sources, including sports. So I don't know if I got that right or not, but I wanted to share that and see if you see it that way. That's good.
Well, I think that you are giving a correct portrayal of the situation that prevails currently. But I think that it's a question of time that those cultures, those business cultures, become more aligned. The values that are at the basis of that corporate culture, I don't think they're relative. I think that they are legitimate and that they're broad, and that if you were to ask individuals in any of the three countries if they hold those values dear, if they espouse those values, such as equality, among genders, they would say yes, right? So we may all have different ways of materializing those values currently, and but I think that we're on the road to becoming more aligned on that as well, precisely because those general values exist among the three countries and business leaders of the three countries.
Great.
I'll add in quickly. I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Corporate culture does tend to transcend. You can look at a lot of companies and how they organize their geographies, especially multinationals. More and more companies are not just having United States as their market, the way that they're organized in terms of their business. They're having an America's market that includes Canada, United States, and Mexico. They're leveraging the headwinds from, or the tailwinds from NAFTA and USMCA, creating a consolidated market. And what this is doing, this is creating a integrated company culture because it's the same leadership leading these teams. And they're cascading on these company values, which are in line with the individual values of the employees across all three regions. And I love the example that you bring up about the culture of integrating women into position of leadership, or professional development and advancement of women. You see that in multinationals in a lot of countries, including in Mexico, than you do in local companies. So that's a great example of how the North American way is really kind of perpetuated by the private sector. I love that example.
Just maybe one more thing that's not specifically related to business, but has a business component. You know what's the fastest growing sport right now in the U.S.?
Pickleball.
Women's soccer.
Oh, I thought it was pickleball.
Women's soccer, I believe that.
And so, we're talking about the World Cup in 2026. The importance of the MLS is growing very fast. Mexican-American players having to decide if they play for the U.S. or Mexico. Talk about North American identity. It's a complex discussion. It takes more time, but I think when you put all of it on the table, it's super interesting.
Thank you. My name is Jorge Ortega. I'm director of an NGO that protects and promotes Mexican World Heritage Cities around the world. And well, you maybe know the Good Country Index. The strongest variable in the Good Country Index for Mexico is culture. And I think that our country has not done a good job on using that powerful soft power that Mexico has. And in this sense, I see difficult to have this North America identity. We have this long story. We are sixth in the world in number of World Heritage Sites, just behind Italy, France, China, Spain, that are very culturally identified countries. And Mexico has not done that job. I see it very challenging to have this North America identity created and communicated. So my question is, what kind of powerful tools you propose to promote this around the world, this North America identity? Of course, football is very strong, strong enough maybe, but that's going to happen only in a month. So what kind of permanent tools we can use for this?
I look at Daniela because my immediate thought is film. No?
I was thinking media, digital media, film.
Yes, I think that the power of film is unsurpassed. I think that film is all year round and it creates a lot of excitement and is always newsworthy. It's I think film. I mean, it's one of the most one of the most wonderful inventions in the world. I would say, really, absolutely. And this year, it was the first time I had gone to Cannes. 2 years I didn't go because of the pandemic. And in Cannes, you see films from 60, 80 countries, people from all around the world. And it's amazing how film or cinema is considered, the universal language, And no matter what, the dialogues are maybe in different languages, whatever, but the power of images in themselves, everybody understands that. Mm-hmm. And so it's very moving to see after the pandemic that film in a big screen still has this amazing power to unite everybody, And so I think that we now have to work on ways in which people engage more with each other. I think that one of the big lessons now is that a lot of people got very depressed, then want to go out, just watching. Even when vaccines were out, I mean, some of the habits of people, like not wanting to go out, not wanting to speak to other people, to meet other people, to see something different, people got too comfortable in their zone, So, but I think that film has the power to really surprise you and to teach you everything around the world, about the world.
I was going to follow
Do you
up.
have a follow-up?
Yeah, follow-up. I wanted to continue with the film line of questioning here because, number one, I love Mexican film. It's beautiful, it's creative, unpredictable. Like, it's just a beautiful genre in itself. But I want to talk, when we're talking about soft power, one aspect of some Mexican film is narco, films that create a not so positive impression of Mexico. How, you're an absolute expert creator and, developed the film industry here. Do you view that as a major problem or barrier to some of the soft power for your major film producers? How do y'all address that at your festival, or how do you think about this?
Well, those are not really films. They're trash. So that trash doesn't belong to film festivals anywhere in the world. I mean, you never see this. I mean, they're TV series or whatever. I actually never watched them. I found them disgusting. And I think that that's a way of making always the stereotypes and working on stereotypes, and it's awful, because it's. I mean, maybe I'm going to say something that's not politically correct, but they should be forbidden to be produced because they also stimulate a lot of young people who look at those series and they think, oh, how wonderful these people are. Like the gangster films in the 1930s, everybody wanted to be like James Cagney, Obviously, those films had artistry in the 1930s. They were much more profound. What you see now in those series and mass-produced products, it's awful, and I think that young people have to kind of like stay away from those contents because I think they're just very demeaning, just awful.
If I may add, I may have a slightly different take on this because it's hard in Mexico to not acknowledge the security situation, right? The hundreds of thousands of deaths in the last 2 decades. We've become the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist. My family is from the northern part of Mexico, from Durango. I went to school in Monterrey at the Tech. So I've been exposed to, people say, narco culture, narco elements of culture, all my life. And now in the US, I see sort of this image of Mexico as a narco state, to be honest, sort of what happened to Colombia in the 80s and 90s. So I think the most important thing, first of all, is to recognize that we do have a problem in terms of security, that it's a shared problem. The largest consumer market for illegal substances in the world is the United States. And also that we need sort of more creative and new solutions to that. We've been struggling with this for over half a century. At the same time, tobacco, for example, was a substance that was starting to be regulated. Look at how well we've done with that. It's become more expensive to produce tobacco, less spaces for advertising, we're more aware of the dangers of consuming tobacco. We took a public health approach to that, and we've made a lot of progress. On the other side, we took a punitive security approach to drugs, and we've made no progress whatsoever, and it's gotten worse. So I think the U.S. should recognize its co-responsibility here, as well as Canada and Mexico on this, and we should definitely address that. And in culture, I think there's a space to address this in a nuanced, a profound way, and not just with the easy, catchy La Reina del Sur and those unfortunate genre of narco novelas and narco series. But I do think there's opportunity in terms of content creation to do something that's meaningful and that's real and that really helps us understand what all of this craziness means.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to bring it back to our panelists for our speed round of helping to brand the North American identity in 3 words or less. So, Daniela, can we start with you?
North American identity?
3 words or less.
Contrast.
Teresa.
All right, so yeah, I had given it some thought. I have drive. I think that our 3 countries are very driven to succeed, very motivated, very entrepreneurial. Community. There's a value of community in all of the 3 countries. And then hear me out about the 3rd one. It's warmth. And I ask you to hear me out because in Mexico, Canadians and people from the United States are not considered particularly warm when compared to Mexicans. But it's all relative, right? When you, I've heard so many stories about U.S. people that are expats in the Nordic countries, right? And how they compare to the people there, and it's funny how sociable Americans really are, and it's just not an idea that Mexicans or Latin Americans in general have about people north of the Mexican border. So it would be great if we could put that into that North American identity and create awareness around that.
Rachel.
My word of the day is innovation. We're innovative, creative, entrepreneurial. We should leverage it.
Brittany.
That's a good one. My 3 words are, first is history, because I think our histories are inextricably linked. You can't talk about history in either of the 3 countries without mentioning the other 2. My second word is future, because I think we have a shared future together. It may be rocky, we may have a bit of a roller coaster, but our future is also intertwined. And then my last word is family. I think of our 3 countries are like 3 siblings. We may bicker, we may fight, we may have our own individual preferences and our uniqueness about us, but we're family and we love each other. And at the end of the day, we do come together.
Enrique.
This is my favorite question of our panel, because I've always been asked to think about identity and identify myself in different ways. I'm an immigrant, I'm Mexican, American, I'm a dad, I'm a journalist, I'm like, what's the label I use? So I'm going to give you 3 words, and I think it really defines me. It's sort of a breakthrough personal moment. Yo soy norteamericano.
Love that. I love that. Well, I say that mic drop. We're done here.
That's it.
But I want to thank our amazing panelists for their insights. This has been such an interesting conversation. I want to thank our participants for being a part of it. And in this era of people-driven diplomacy, I hope that you all see yourselves as diplomats and you have the power to shape the North American identity. So please join me in thanking our panelists and the U.S.-Mexico Foundation.